The soft hum of the kettle pulled Sarah from her thoughts. The kitchen window looked out onto the sleepy streets of Riverside, where the sun hung low, casting warm golden light over the lawns. It was the kind of town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors waved in the mornings and children played freely until dusk. She loved it here. It felt like the perfect place to start their life together. Jack had been everything she dreamed of. They'd met 3 years ago at a mutual friend's wedding. And from that day on, it felt like fate was unfolding exactly as it should. He was hard-working, kind, and thoughtful. It wasn't unusual for him to come home after long shifts with a bouquet of flowers, his grin wide, and his eyes twinkling. Sarah had never imagined she could be this lucky, but lately things had changed in small, almost imperceptible ways. Jack still smiled, still kissed her on the forehead when he left for work, but there was a distance she couldn't quite put her finger on. He no longer stayed up late to talk about their future, the dreams of building a family they once shared. Instead, he'd sit at the table, poring over bills and muttering about expenses. Sarah glanced at the calendar hanging above the sink. 8 weeks pregnant. They hadn't told anyone yet, wanting to wait until they were sure, but the signs were becoming more obvious every day. She smiled to herself, pressing a hand gently to her abdomen, as if she could already feel the baby growing inside. The front door opened with a soft click, and Jack stepped in, shrugging off his coat. His face, usually bright when he saw her, looked tired, lines of frustration tugging at his features. "Hey," he muttered, dropping the coat over the back of the chair. "Anything for dinner?" Sarah hesitated. "I was going to make something, but I've been feeling a little nauseous today. Maybe we can order in." Jack didn't answer at first. He ran a hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. "I guess I'll figure something out then." There it was, that subtle shift. She could feel the tension, the way his movements seemed heavier now. Jack wasn't a man who liked surprises, and this pregnancy, though wanted, had clearly unsettled him. "How was work?" she asked, trying to ease the air between them. "Busy," he replied, opening the fridge and staring into it. "The guys are working overtime, and it's cutting into my evenings." Sarah bit her lip. "I could start teaching more hours once the baby comes. Maybe that would help a little with the finances." Jack closed the fridge, his jaw tight. "No, I've told you before. I'll take care of it. We don't need you stressing out about money. Just focus on the baby." She nodded, but couldn't shake the way his words seemed to carry a weight they hadn't before. He had always been protective, but lately it felt more controlling than caring. She glanced down at her hand, noticing how her fingers absent-mindedly traced the outline of the ring on her finger. Jack wasn't wrong. They didn't need the extra money right now, but his insistence on handling everything on his own was starting to worry her. Later that night, as Sarah sat in bed with a book resting in her lap, she listened to the sound of Jack moving around downstairs. The creak of the floorboards, the quiet clink of dishes in the sink. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He was simply distant. When he finally came upstairs, he didn't say much. He slipped into bed beside her, pulling the covers up, without a word. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. "Yeah, just tired. Don't worry about it." But she did worry. She worried about the long hours he was putting in, the way he barely looked at her anymore, how he always seemed lost in thought. She missed the Jack who would wrap his arms around her after a long day and talk about everything and nothing. The Jack who laughed at their plans for the future, who seemed as excited about the baby as she was. Turning off the bedside lamp, Sarah lay back, staring up at the ceiling. The warm glow of Riverside's streetlights filtered in through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the room. She tried to shake off the unease gnawing at her. It was probably just the hormones, she told herself. The pregnancy was making everything feel more intense. Jack would come around. He just needed time. Jack's laughter used to fill the house. It wasn't loud or overbearing, but it had a way of making the walls feel less empty. Now, that sound was rare. The house itself seemed quieter, heavier. Sarah could feel it in the way the floors creaked under her feet as she moved around, folding clothes, adjusting pillows, rearranging the nursery. She told herself it was just the pregnancy that made her hyper-aware of everything. The sounds, the silences, the spaces Jack no longer filled. But deep down, she knew something had changed. It started small. Jack would come home later than usual, shrugging off his coat with a distracted grunt instead of the warm greeting he used to offer. Sarah had asked him once, during dinner, if something was wrong. He had looked up from his plate, barely meeting her eyes, and said, "Work's just busy, Sarah. Don't worry about it." That was weeks ago. Now it wasn't just late nights. It was the way he avoided her questions about the baby, how he seemed to disappear into his own thoughts, leaving Sarah feeling more alone than ever. Tonight, it was past midnight when Jack finally stumbled in. His breath smelled faintly of whiskey, the kind he only drank when he was out with his co-workers. He kicked off his shoes haphazardly and slumped into the living room chair without a word. "Did you have a good night?" Sarah asked from the doorway, her voice tentative. She could hear the quiet tension in her own words, like she was stepping carefully around an unseen minefield. Jack leaned back, rubbing his temples. "Yeah, fine." She hesitated. "You've been out a lot lately." He exhaled, long and heavy, like the weight of the conversation was too much for him. "I'm tired, Sarah. Can we not do this tonight?" "I'm not trying to start a fight," she said, softly, stepping into the room. I miss you. We barely talk anymore." Jack didn't respond immediately. His eyes were fixed on some invisible point in front of him. Finally, he muttered, "We don't have to talk about everything all the time." Sarah bit her lip, her hand resting on the growing curve of her stomach. She could feel the baby moving, a subtle flutter under her skin. "It's not about everything. It's about us, Jack, and the baby. I feel like you're not here anymore." He flinched at the mention of the baby, a small gesture, but enough to confirm what Sarah had suspected. Jack didn't say anything, just ran a hand through his hair and stood up. "I'm going to bed." He brushed past her, the faint smell of alcohol lingering in the air as he disappeared down the hallway. Sarah stood there for a long moment, listening to his footsteps fade. The house felt impossibly quiet again. In the weeks that followed, Jack's detachment only grew. When Sarah had excitedly brought up decorating the nursery, he had barely looked up from the newspaper. "Do we really need all this stuff? Half of it's unnecessary," he'd muttered. His words stung, but Sarah had let it go, convincing herself that it was just his way of dealing with the stress of impending fatherhood. She had gone ahead and decorated the nursery anyway, painted the walls a soft, pale blue, and hung small clouds on the ceiling. It had been the one thing that made her feel connected to the baby, to the future she was desperately trying to believe in. But when Jack saw the finished room, he'd simply shrugged, muttering something about wasting money. The baby's crib stood by the window now, bathed in the soft glow of the afternoon light. Sarah often found herself sitting in the nursery for hours, letting her fingers trace the edges of the crib, trying to imagine what it would be like when their child was finally there. It was in this room, more than anywhere else, that the gap between her and Jack felt widest. Jack, on the other hand, had begun retreating more and more into himself. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his co-workers. He'd spend hours in the living room scrolling through news on his laptop, barely looking up when Sarah passed by. Conversations about the baby were always brief, with Jack offering curt, dismissive responses. One evening, as Sarah made dinner, the sound of Jack's car pulling into the driveway filled her with an odd sense of dread. He walked in, dropped his keys on the counter and said, "I'm going to need to stay late again tomorrow. Don't wait up." Sarah turned to him, trying to mask her disappointment. "Can we talk about the baby's name tonight at least? We haven't—" Jack sighed, cutting her off. "Can't we deal with that later? It's not like the kid's coming tomorrow." The sharpness in his tone made her pause. She set the spoon down on the counter, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "Jack, I'm just trying to plan—" "Yeah, well, maybe stop planning so much. It's not like we need to be ready for every little thing." His voice had a tired edge, one that made it clear he wasn't interested in the conversation. Sarah swallowed, her heart sinking. Jack didn't look at her, didn't offer any apology or reassurance. He just walked away, leaving her standing there, alone again. The pale light of dawn filtered through the hospital room window, casting a soft glow over Sarah as she sat on the edge of the bed, cradling Noah in her arms. Outside, the world was still waking up. Inside, she had never felt more awake. She watched her newborn son with a mixture of awe and exhaustion. His tiny chest rose and fell rhythmically, and in the silence of the room, she could hear the soft, occasional sighs escaping his lips. Noah's skin was warm under her fingertips, and her gaze fell on the small birthmark, nestled at the nape of his neck, a heart-shaped mark. She smiled softly to herself, tracing the outline with a gentle finger. It felt like a sign, like this little boy was meant to fill a space in her heart she hadn't known existed. The long nights of waiting, the slow drift away from Jack's once loving attention, it all seemed distant now, softened by the arrival of this new life. Jack was sitting by the window, his back to them, scrolling through his phone. He had barely looked up when Noah was born, his congratulations brief, distant. Now, as the baby stirred in her arms, Sarah felt the absence of Jack's excitement. The hospital room was too quiet, a quiet that made her feel isolated, even with the child nestled against her. She spoke softly, not wanting to disturb the baby. "He has a birthmark, Jack. It's shaped like a little heart. Isn't that something?" Jack made a noise, something between a grunt and a sigh. He didn't turn around. "Yeah, that's nice," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on his phone. The response was thin, hollow. Sarah looked down at Noah, her fingers smoothing the blanket over his tiny body. She didn't press. The past few months had taught her that pushing Jack only made him withdraw further. But the silence between them weighed heavy, and it was becoming harder to carry. Later that night, back home in Riverside, the first cries echoed through the small house. Sarah, still sore and drained from the delivery, stirred and rose slowly from the bed. Jack, beside her, didn't move. "Noah's crying," she whispered, her voice a mix of exhaustion and need. She waited, hoping Jack might respond, might get up and offer to help. He groaned, rolling over without opening his eyes. "Can't you take care of it? I've got work in the morning." Sarah pressed her lips together, not trusting herself to speak. She got up, moving slowly toward the nursery where Noah's cries pierced the quiet. The little room she had so carefully decorated now felt enormous, the crib too large and the soft blue walls almost mocking her sense of calm from just days ago. She scooped Noah into her arms, swaying gently to soothe him. His cries softened into whimpers, and she pressed a kiss to the top of his head. But the weight of everything, of Jack's indifference, of the sleepless nights that stretched ahead, settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The following weeks blurred into a routine of long nights and quiet days. Jack grew more distant, spending hours on his phone or at work, barely acknowledging Noah's presence. Every evening Sarah would sit with Noah, humming soft lullabies, while Jack sat in the living room, the volume of the television turned up just loud enough to drown out the baby's cries. It wasn't outright resentment, but Jack's detachment was clear in every small gesture. When she asked him to hold Noah, he'd decline, claiming he was too tired or too busy. When Noah cried, he would leave the room or simply turn the TV up louder, never once offering to help. One night, Sarah finally confronted him. She had just put Noah to bed, her arms aching from the constant motion of rocking him to sleep. Jack sat in the living room, the blue glow of the television reflecting off his face. "Jack, can we talk?" He glanced at her, his expression flat. "About what?" Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "About Noah. About us. You're not here, Jack. You're not helping." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "Sarah, I work all day. The baby's your responsibility. You wanted this, remember?" Her stomach tightened at his words. "He's our son, Jack. This isn't just my problem." Jack's eyes flicked back to the television. "I'm doing what I can. Stop making it such a big deal." Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling the gap between them widen even further. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, the ground beneath her feet crumbling a little more each day. Without another word, she turned and walked back to the nursery, where Noah slept soundly, unaware of the growing tension in the house. She sat by the crib, watching him breathe, and wondered how much longer she could keep pretending that everything would be okay. The sun hung low in the sky when Sarah decided to leave for the store. Noah had just fallen asleep after a fussy afternoon, his tiny breaths even and soft. She lingered by the crib for a moment, watching his chest rise and fall beneath the light blue blanket. "I'll be quick," she whispered, as if Noah could hear her. She gently shut the nursery door, picked up her keys, and headed out. The grocery store was just 10 minutes away, and Sarah mentally ran through her list as she walked the aisles. Milk, diapers, bread, the usual. She tried not to rush, but something in her chest felt tight, as though time were pressing against her. Jack was at work and she'd be home in less than an hour. Noah would still be asleep by then. When Sarah pulled into the driveway, the house was quiet, exactly as she'd left it. The warm glow of the late afternoon sun bathed the front porch in light, casting long shadows across the yard. She unlocked the door and slipped inside, her bags rustling as she set them on the kitchen counter. The silence felt thick, like the air had stilled while she was gone. She walked to the nursery, pushing open the door with the same quiet care as always. The crib came into view, but it was empty. A cold rush ran through her body. For a second, Sarah just stared at the crib, unable to make sense of the emptiness before her. The blanket, still slightly rumpled from where Noah had slept, was the only sign he'd ever been there. Her heart began to race. "Noah!" she called out, barely above a whisper, her voice shaky. She quickly scanned the room, her eyes darting from corner to corner, searching for something, anything, that would explain where her baby had gone. But there was nothing, no sign of him. The panic hit all at once. "Noah!" Sarah's voice cracked as she rushed into the hallway, her footsteps echoing off the walls. She checked the living room, the kitchen, every room in the house. He couldn't have just disappeared. He couldn't. He was just a baby. He couldn't crawl out of the crib, much less leave the house on his own. Her breathing became ragged as she retraced her steps, frantically searching the same rooms over and over again, even though she knew she wouldn't find him. The walls seemed to close in around her, suffocating as the reality began to sink in. "Noah!" she screamed, her voice desperate now. She stumbled back into the nursery, gripping the edge of the crib as her legs threatened to give way. Her hands were trembling, her chest tightening with each passing second. Where could he be? How could this have happened? The front door creaked, and Jack's voice echoed through the house. "Sarah? What's going on?" She didn't answer immediately. Her throat was dry, her voice barely there. When she finally spoke, it came out in a choked whisper. "Noah's gone." Jack appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What do you mean, gone? He was just here." "I don't know." Sarah's voice cracked and tears welled in her eyes. "I went to the store, and when I came back he wasn't here. I've looked everywhere, Jack. He's gone." Jack's face hardened as the weight of her words hit him. He scanned the room, checking behind the crib, as though expecting Noah to be hiding somewhere Sarah had missed. But the emptiness of the room was undeniable. "Call the police," Jack muttered, his voice low and clipped. Sarah's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, the numbers blurring before her eyes as she dialed. Jack stood rigid, pacing the room with clenched fists, glancing around like he could force Noah back into existence with sheer will. The police arrived not long after. They questioned Sarah and Jack, combing through the house for any sign of the baby. But there was nothing. No broken window, no forced entry. Just an empty crib and two parents, standing in shock. In the days that followed, the house seemed to grow colder, quieter. Jack, once frantically concerned, became distant. At first he stayed home from work, checking in with the police, asking questions. But as the days dragged on with no sign of Noah, his patience wore thin. "Maybe—" Jack's voice was sharp one evening as Sarah sat at the kitchen table staring blankly at a photo of Noah. "Maybe it's time we accept that he's not coming back." Sarah shot him a look, disbelief and anger twisting in her chest. "How can you say that? He's our son." Jack's eyes were hard, his jaw tight. "He's gone, Sarah." But Sarah couldn't. She wouldn't. Noah was out there somewhere, and she would find him, no matter how long it took. The sun was already low when Sarah trudged through the front door, her shoulders sagging with the weight of another day spent cleaning houses in Maplewood. Her hands, raw from scrubbing floors and polishing windows, shook slightly as she set her bag down by the entrance. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. It always was now. She took a deep breath, bracing herself for what she knew was coming. Jack would be back soon, smelling of whiskey and slurring his words. It had been years since Noah disappeared, years since Sarah had felt anything but the gnawing ache of loss. Every day she woke up hoping that today would be different, that maybe this would be the day Jack came home sober, the day he asked her how she was doing, the day he showed any sign of the man she had once loved. But that man was long gone, buried under layers of alcohol and anger. The door slammed open, startling Sarah. Jack stumbled in, his eyes glassy, a crooked grin on his face. "Hey," he slurred, leaning heavily on the doorframe. You home late?" "Work ran over," Sarah said quietly, avoiding his gaze as she moved toward the kitchen. She grabbed a dishcloth, her hands shaking as she wrung it out. "I can make you something to eat if you want." Jack waved a dismissive hand, his unsteady feet taking him toward the couch. "Don't bother. I'm not hungry." Sarah watched him from the kitchen, her heart heavy as he collapsed onto the couch. He hadn't eaten much in days, surviving mostly on whiskey and whatever snacks he could find. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his once sharp eyes were now dull, almost lifeless. He was unrecognizable. It had started slowly, not long after Noah disappeared. Jack had gone out for drinks with his co-workers, just a way to take the edge off, he said. But one night turned into many, and soon the bar became his second home. At first, he'd come back apologetic, mumbling excuses about needing to clear his head. Then the excuses stopped, and the drinking became routine. Sarah, too tired to fight, let it happen. She glanced around the house, seeing the marks of Jack's descent everywhere, the piles of empty bottles by the couch, the unwashed dishes in the sink, the general disarray of a life that had spiraled out of control. She cleaned as much as she could in the mornings before heading off to work, but there was only so much she could do. Jack, sensing her eyes on him, turned to face her, his expression hardening. "What are you looking at?" he snapped, his words thick with drink. "Always watching, always waiting for me to screw up." "I'm not," Sarah said softly, turning her back to him, pretending to busy herself at the sink. I wish you'd take care of yourself, Jack." "Take care of myself." Jack let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh in the quiet house. "What's the point? We're broken, Sarah. The kid's gone, and you're here pretending like we can just move on." His words hit her like a slap. She gripped the edge of the counter, the ache in her chest threatening to overwhelm her. "I'm not pretending," she whispered. "I'm trying to survive." Jack threw his head back, laughing again, but there was no humor in it. "Survive? What's the point? You think Noah's coming back? You think any of this matters?" His voice grew louder, more aggressive. "He's gone, Sarah. He's gone. And it's your fault." The words cut deep, but they weren't new. Jack had blamed her for Noah's disappearance almost from the start. Every time the police came up with nothing, every time a search party returned empty-handed, Jack's anger would flare, and the accusations would fly. Sarah had learned to bear it in silence. She turned around, facing him fully now, her exhaustion visible in the dark circles under her eyes, the slump of her shoulders. "I didn't lose him, Jack," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "We both did," Jack sneered, picking up an empty bottle from the coffee table and throwing it across the room. It shattered against the wall, pieces scattering across the floor. "Yeah, well, I'm the only one paying for it." Sarah didn't flinch. She had learned not to, over the months of broken bottles and slammed doors. She just stood there, staring at the shards of glass, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. Her body was exhausted, her mind even more so. But still, she got up every morning. Still, she worked. And still, she hoped, even if it was foolish, even if it hurt. Jack slumped back against the couch, his outburst over, the fight draining out of him. His head lolled to the side, and within minutes he was asleep, snoring softly. Sarah stood in the kitchen staring at the broken glass, wondering when, if ever, things would change. But deep down she already knew the answer. The morning had started like any other. Sarah was in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes from the night before, her mind far away from the task at hand. The silence in the house had become its own kind of companion, oppressive but familiar. Jack had been in and out of the living room, grumbling under his breath. Another hangover, another argument waiting to happen, she thought. Then she heard the crash. The sound of something heavy hitting the floor sent her rushing into the living room. Jack was lying there, His body twisted awkwardly, one hand clutching his side, his face contorted in pain. "Jack!" she shouted, dropping to her knees beside him. His eyes were squeezed shut, his breathing shallow. He tried to speak, but couldn't get the words out. Panic gripped her. "Stay with me, Jack," she said, fumbling for her phone to call 911. The dispatcher's voice was a blur, instructions coming too fast for her to process fully. All she knew was that Jack needed help, and he needed it now. The minutes between the call and the ambulance's arrival felt like an eternity. Sarah hovered over Jack, her hands shaking as she tried to comfort him. His skin was clammy, his breathing ragged. She had never seen him like this. So vulnerable, so small. When the paramedics finally arrived, they lifted Jack onto a stretcher, their movements swift and practiced. Sarah followed them out, her heart pounding as they loaded him into the back of the ambulance. The ride to the hospital in Newport was a blur of flashing lights and muted sirens. Jack lay unconscious, his face pale and drawn. Sarah sat beside him, her hand gripping the edge of the stretcher, feeling utterly powerless. She had hated him for so long, for the drinking, for the distance, for the cruel words that had chipped away at her soul. But in that moment, all she could think about was keeping him alive. At the hospital, they rushed Jack into the emergency room. A nurse directed Sarah to the waiting area, but she couldn't sit still. She paced the sterile hallway, her mind racing. The hours they spent together, the years of hurt and disappointment, all seemed to collapse into this single moment. She wanted to scream, to cry, to run, but instead she waited. Finally, a doctor emerged. His white coat was crisp, his expression serious. "Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, glancing at the clipboard in his hands. Sarah stepped forward, her voice barely steady. "Yes, that's me." "I'm Dr. William," he said, extending his hand briefly. "Your husband has suffered acute kidney failure. His condition is critical. We're stabilizing him now, but he'll need a kidney transplant to survive." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. "A transplant?" she repeated, her voice faint. Dr. William nodded. "Yes, he won't make it without one." Sarah felt the weight of the world settle onto her shoulders. Jack had been cruel, distant, and reckless, but he was still her husband. She couldn't just let him die. "What do we do?" she asked, her throat tightening. The doctor's face softened, as if he understood the enormity of the decision before her. "We'll need to find a compatible donor. We'll run tests on his family members. It's a race against time, but we'll do everything we can." Sarah nodded, numb. "Can I see him?" Dr. William gestured toward the room down the hall. "He's stable for now. You can sit with him." The room was cold and sterile, the soft hum of machines the only sound. Jack lay still in the bed, tubes running from his arms, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. He looked fragile, a far cry from the angry, belligerent man who had once thrown dishes and slurred insults in this very home. Sarah sat beside him, her fingers brushing against his hand. It was limp, lifeless. She couldn't bring herself to let go. Hours passed, but Sarah stayed, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The bags under her eyes told the story of sleepless nights, of long days cleaning houses in Maplewood, of caring for a man who had stopped caring for himself and for her long ago. But she stayed. Even with the bitterness lodged deep in her chest, she stayed. Not because she wanted to, but because, despite everything, she couldn't walk away. Not now. As the night wore on, Sarah leaned her head against the edge of the bed, her grip on Jack's hand tightening. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the machines. She closed her eyes, the weight of it all finally pressing down on her, suffocating her thoughts. He was still her husband. And despite the pain, she wasn't ready to say goodbye, not yet. Dr. Williams stood just outside the hospital room, observing the scene through the small window in the door. Inside, Sarah sat by Jack's bedside, her fingers lightly grazing the back of his hand. The machines beeped steadily, but the weight in the room was unmistakable. Jack, a man who had caused so much suffering, lay motionless, a shell of his former self. Yet Sarah remained, silent, vigilant, never leaving his side. There was something about the way she held herself, exhausted, yes, but resilient, that stirred something deep in William. He had seen families in this position before, watching loved ones suffer. But this was different. There was a quiet anguish in Sarah's eyes, a deep, unspoken pain that seemed to transcend her immediate circumstances. It wasn't just the weight of Jack's illness. It was the years of betrayal, the scars that Jack's actions had left on her soul. And yet, despite all of it, she stayed. William's gaze softened as he watched her. She wiped her eyes when she thought no one was looking, and though her back was straight, her hands trembled slightly. Her strength wasn't in grand gestures, but in the quiet, steady way she continued to care for a man who had long ceased caring for her. He stepped away from the window, his mind spinning. Something in this woman's devotion, her quiet suffering, had struck a chord in him. He didn't know why, but he felt the need to help her, to offer something beyond his clinical duty. After a moment's hesitation, William walked to the lab, requesting the necessary tests. If he was a match, he would donate his kidney to the man inside, for her sake. The air in the hospital hallway felt heavier that day, a quiet tension lingering as Sarah approached Dr. Williams' office. She had asked to meet with him after hearing the news. He was a match for Jack, willing to donate his kidney to save her husband's life. The decision had left her both grateful and bewildered. She had never expected such an act of kindness from a man she barely knew. When Sarah entered, Dr. Williams stood by his desk, paperwork scattered around. He looked up with a calm expression, though there was something in his eyes, something that seemed to study her deeper than before. "Dr. William," she began, her voice soft, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing for Jack. I don't know how to express how much this means." Dr. William nodded, his gaze momentarily dropping to the floor. "I couldn't stand by and do nothing," he said quietly. "I saw what you were going through, and no one deserves to bear that alone." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that Sarah felt deep in her chest. She watched him for a moment, trying to understand why he seemed so familiar, why there was this strange connection that she couldn't quite place. Then, as he turned slightly, she caught a glimpse of the back of his neck. Her breath hitched. The birthmark. It was small, almost insignificant, but she had seen it before. It was the same shape, the same spot. She had kissed it 1,000 times when Noah was a baby. A sharp jolt of recognition coursed through her, and her heart began to race. "Dr. William," she stammered, her voice trembling, "that birthmark—" He frowned, confused. "What?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her hand instinctively rising to her mouth. "You have a birthmark, right there, just like my son." William's face paled slightly, the realization dawning on him slowly, but he didn't move. He just stood there, watching her unravel. "My son." "Noah," Sarah whispered, the words catching in her throat. "He was taken from me when he was a baby. He had that same mark. I think you might be—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The enormity of it was too much to comprehend. Could it be possible? After all these years? Dr. William remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, He stepped around the desk and gently reached for her hand. "Let's do a test," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the whirlwind of emotions that were beginning to swirl between them. "We can find out." The test was quick, though the waiting felt agonizing. Sarah sat in the hospital chair, her hands trembling in her lap. She didn't know what to hope for. Could this man, this stranger who had stepped in to save Jack, really be the boy she had lost? Hours later, Dr. William returned with the results in his hands. His face was different now, softer, more vulnerable. He handed her the paper, saying nothing, just watching as her eyes scanned the page. The confirmation hit her like a wave, crashing over her with all the force of years of grief and longing. He was Noah. He was her son. The papers slipped from her hands as tears filled her eyes. Sarah stood slowly, her legs shaking beneath her, and walked toward him, reaching out with trembling fingers to touch his face. She could barely breathe, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. "Noah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's you. It's really you." Dr. William, Noah, stood frozen, staring at her with a stunned silence. His entire world had just been upended, and the reality of it was too large to grasp all at once. He didn't say anything at first, just looked into her tear-filled eyes, his own emotions too raw to form words. Sarah's hands trembled as she gently cupped his face, her touch light as though she were afraid he might disappear. And then, in a rush of overwhelming relief, she pulled him into her arms, holding him tight against her, sobbing softly into his shoulder. Noah hesitated for only a moment before his arms wrapped around her, tentative at first, then tighter as the truth settled in. His breath shook, and he held her as though trying to make up for all the years lost between them. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, the world outside falling away. There were no words that could capture the depth of their reunion, no explanations that could mend the broken years. But in that quiet, powerful embrace, mother and son were finally whole again. Jack awoke to the sterile smell of the hospital room, his body aching and heavy from the surgery. His mind was groggy, but the steady beeping of machines tethered him to the present. He blinked, trying to make sense of his surroundings, when Sarah's face came into view, sitting in the chair beside his bed, her expression unreadable. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her voice distant, almost mechanical. He swallowed, his throat dry. "Like hell," he rasped, wincing as he shifted on the bed. "What happened?" For a moment, Sarah didn't respond. She glanced at the floor, her fingers playing with the edge of the hospital blanket. The transplant was successful. Dr. William, he was a match. He donated his kidney, and he is your son. Jack froze. The words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on him. Dr. William, his son, their son. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, his breath catching in his throat. "Noah." His voice trembled, the guilt gnawing at him from the inside. Sarah didn't move, didn't meet his eyes. "Yes, he gave you a part of himself to save your life," she said quietly, the bitterness in her tone barely masked. Jack's chest tightened. He could feel the guilt rising, the dark, suffocating shame that had haunted him for years. He'd spent so long hiding from the truth, burying it deep under layers of anger and denial. But now, there was no escaping it. Not when the boy he had abandoned, left to die, had unknowingly saved him. He felt his hands tremble, his voice weak. I need to tell you something, Sarah." She remained silent, her gaze still fixed on the floor. Jack struggled to sit up. The pain from the surgery, nothing compared to the agony of what he was about to confess. He couldn't avoid it any longer. Not after this. "It was me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "That night, when Noah disappeared. I was drunk. I didn't want a kid, Sarah. I thought it would ruin everything. His voice caught in his throat, his words turning into a broken gasp. "I took him. I carried him out to the street. I threw him into the storm drain." He forced the words out, each one cutting into him like a knife. "I left him there, Sarah. I left our son to die." The silence that followed was suffocating. Jack couldn't bring himself to look at her, his shoulders hunched as though trying to shrink away from the weight of his guilt. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, but the silence between them was louder than any scream. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold, devoid of any warmth or empathy. "You threw our son away." Jack flinched, his heart pounding in his chest. "I was drunk," he stammered, desperate to explain, to make her understand. "I wasn't thinking. I've regretted it every single day since. Please, Sarah, Stop." The word was sharp, cutting through his plea like a blade. Sarah stood, her face expressionless, but her eyes were filled with a fury so quiet, so controlled, that it terrified him. Jack looked up at her, the desperation evident in his eyes. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't know how to fix it. I couldn't face it." Her gaze remained locked on him, unflinching. "You took away our child because you were scared," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You left him to die like he was nothing. And now you want forgiveness?" Jack's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. "Please, Sarah," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm begging you." But Sarah didn't respond. She stood there, her expression unreadable, her hands clenched at her sides. The fury, the betrayal, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface. She stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with each breath. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the sterile hospital room. Jack watched her go, his body trembling, the weight of his confession crashing down on him like a tidal wave. The door clicked shut, and Jack was left alone with his guilt, the sound of his own shallow breaths filling the empty space. Sarah walked out of Jack's hospital room, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as she replayed Jack's confession in her head, the night he'd thrown their son into the storm drain, leaving him to die. She needed space, needed to breathe, but more than anything, she needed answers. She found herself walking down the long corridor toward Dr. Williams' office. Noah. He was Noah, her son, the man who had unknowingly saved Jack's life. How had he survived? Who had saved him after Jack's monstrous act? Dr. William looked up as she entered, a soft frown crossing his face. "Mum, what's wrong?" She sat down heavily in the chair across from him, her hands trembling. "I know what Jack did," she whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "He confessed about Noah, about abandoning him." William's face darkened, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. "How did you survive?" she asked, her voice breaking. "How did you make it through that night?" William exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. "It's a strange story," he began, his voice soft. "I don't remember much about that night, but what I do know is that I wasn't alone. There was a woman, an older woman, poor, living on the edge of town. She saw Jack that night. She saw what he did." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What?" William nodded. "She couldn't believe what she was seeing, but she acted. She pulled me from the drain, took me home, and cared for me like I was her own. She didn't have much, but she gave me everything she could. She didn't report it because, well, she was scared. Scared of the authorities, scared of losing me. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. The cruelty of Jack's actions, the kindness of this stranger, it was too much to process. Just then, a nurse appeared at the door, her face tense. "Dr. William," she said urgently, "Jack is showing signs of transplant rejection. You need to come right away." William stood immediately, his face hardening. Sarah remained frozen in her chair, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Jack was dying, and yet here was her son, alive, standing before her because of the kindness of a stranger. Life had a cruel way of circling back. Jack's body lay still, the machines around him silent. The nurse had disconnected them minutes before, and now the room felt unnaturally quiet. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, staring at the lifeless form of the man she had once loved. Jack's face, hollow and pale, was frozen in a kind of peace that he had never found in life. His death felt inevitable, a final consequence for the pain he had caused, the betrayals that had fractured their lives. Noah stood beside her, his expression hard to read. There were no tears, no visible grief, just a quiet acceptance. They both knew Jack's end was not just the failure of his body, but a reckoning for the choices he had made. "He's gone," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but soft. She felt no anger now, no sorrow, just a strange calm, as though the weight she had carried for so many years had finally been lifted. Noah nodded, his gaze lingering on Jack for a moment longer before turning away. "I guess it's over." Sarah didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both understood. Jack's death was the closing of a dark chapter, but there was something else now, something lighter, a possibility of starting over. The next morning, Sarah and Noah left the hospital and drove to the small town where Lilia, Noah's adoptive mother, lived. It was a modest place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where small acts of kindness went unnoticed because they were simply expected. Lilia's house was simple, with a faded wooden porch and a garden that had been lovingly tended. Sarah had never met the woman who had saved Noah's life, but she felt a deep gratitude to her, a gratitude she didn't know how to express. When they arrived, Lilia greeted them at the door with a warm smile, her hands calloused from years of hard work. She was older now, her hair streaked with grey, but there was a light in her eyes, a kindness that radiated from her. "You must be Sarah," Lilia said, her voice gentle. She reached out and took Sarah's hands in her own, giving them a comforting squeeze. "I'm so glad to finally meet you." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat, her voice catching. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything, for taking care of him." Lilia smiled, glancing over at Noah, who stood quietly by the door. He was never a burden. He brought joy to my life. The three of them sat on the porch for hours, talking about the past, about Noah's childhood, about the small miracles that had brought them all together. Lilia shared stories of Noah growing up, stories Sarah had never known but cherished now. It was strange, listening to tales of her son's life that she hadn't been part of, but instead of feeling regret, Sarah felt a deep sense of peace. Noah had been loved, had been cared for, even in her absence. When the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, Sarah and Noah said their goodbyes. Lilia promised they would see each other again soon, and as they drove away, Sarah felt something new, a sense of closure, of finally having found the missing pieces of her life. The road to Cedarbrook stretched ahead of them, winding through the fields and hills. The town was small, peaceful, just like Sarah had imagined. It was a place where they could start fresh, away from the memories that had haunted them for so long. As they drove, the familiar sights of Riverside faded into the distance. The weight that had pressed down on Sarah for years, the anger and grief, seemed to lift with every mile they put behind them. She glanced over at Noah, who was staring out the window, his expression calm. "It's strange," he said quietly, his voice thoughtful. "How things turned out. I never thought I'd end up here with you." Sarah smiled, her hand steady on the wheel. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But maybe that's the beauty of it. We're still here. We're together." Noah nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, we are." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. As they approached their new home, a small house on the edge of Cedarbrook, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They pulled into the driveway, the engine humming softly before she turned it off. For a moment, they both sat there, taking in the quiet stillness of their new beginning. "This is it," Sarah said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. "A fresh start." Noah looked at her, his eyes soft. "Yeah," he said. "It's time." Together they stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The door opened easily, welcoming them into a future free from the shadows of the past. And as the night settled in, Sarah knew that they were finally home, at peace, ready to embrace whatever came next. Thank you so much for joining me today and taking the time to experience this emotional journey. Stories like Sarah and Noah's remind us that relationships, parenthood, and life itself are complex, filled with joy, tension, and unexpected challenges. If this story touched you, or if you've ever faced moments of silence in your own relationships, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the most difficult conversations are the ones we need to have the most. Let's keep the conversation going. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and, of course, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the heart of human experience. Thanks again for being here, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay connected, stay inspired, and take care.